Before tonight's journey begins, let me know where you're listening from. Now settle in, let your shoulders soften, let your breathing slow, and allow the day to drift quietly away. Tonight we travel to Marlingate Lane in October of 1911, to a small cobblestone alley in the village of St. Mary's Bay, where the rain falls steadily on slate roofs and the sea mutters 2 miles off. Among them is Arthur Pendleton, a 58-year-old cobbler, carrying one leather satchel, one brass lamp, and the weight of a grief that wakes him each night at 3 in the morning. He expects only a quiet evening mending boots, a cup of tea, and the slow tick of the clock on his mantle. But the letter that arrives in the damp twilight will send him out into the dark, along a winding lane that leads to a cottage where a retired clockmaker keeps a different kind of time. This is the story of Arthur Pendleton, and of one autumn night when a man who had forgotten how to wait discovers that the careful mending of things, whether leather, brass, or a broken heart, requires not haste, but patience. So close your eyes, breathe gently, and let the sound of the rain and the distant sea carry you through the scent of leather and sleep. The workshop was a narrow room at the front of the house, its single window looking out onto Marlingate Lane, and the gaslight from the street lamp farthest down the hill threw a faint, wavering pool of yellow onto the wet cobbles. Arthur Pendleton sat at his bench, his back to the wall, the last of the daylight gone. The brass lamp at his elbow burned with a steady, low flame, and its light fell across the half-finished boot in his hands, a gentleman's walking boot of dark brown calfskin, the sole nearly attached, the stitches small and even, each one pulled taut with the same pressure, the same rhythm, the same patience he had learned 43 years ago when he was 15 and apprenticed to old Mr. Treadwell on the High Street. He set the boot down and rubbed his eyes. The rain had been falling since midday, a soft, persistent drizzle that soaked the thatch and sent rivulets down the window pane, and the air in the workshop was thick with the smell of damp leather, beeswax, and the faint, sweet smoke of the fire in the back room. He had been working since 6:30 that morning, with only a brief pause for a bowl of broth at noon, and his shoulders ached, and his fingers, though still steady, had begun to feel the cold that crept in through the floorboards. He was just about to reach for the kettle. He would boil water, make a pot of strong tea, and perhaps allow himself a slice of the seed cake Mrs. Bellamy had left on his doorstep 2 days ago, when he heard the knock. It was not a loud knock, nor an urgent one. It came 3 times, measured, a little hesitant, as though the person on the other side of the door was not entirely sure they had the right address. Arthur set down the boot and stood, his knees cracking, and crossed the short distance to the door. He unlatched it and pulled it open, and the cold, damp air rushed in, carrying the smell of wet wool and wet earth and the distant salt of the sea. The boy standing on the step was perhaps 12 years old, bareheaded, his hair plastered to his forehead, his coat too thin for the weather. He held out a letter, the envelope damp at the edges, his hand trembling slightly, whether from cold or from the effort of having run up the hill, Arthur could not tell. "For Mr. Pendleton," the boy said, his voice breathless. "From Mrs. Hargreaves at Cliff Cottage. She said it was urgent." Arthur took the letter. The paper was good quality, cream-colored, and the address was written in a careful, sloping hand. Mr. Arthur Pendleton, Cobbler, 7 Marlingate Lane. He turned it over, but there was no seal, only the name of the sender on the back. Mrs. Eleanor Hargreaves, Cliff Cottage, the Western Road. "Thank you, lad," he said, and he reached into his pocket for a penny, but the boy was already backing away, shaking his head. "She said to wait for an answer, sir." Arthur nodded and stepped back into the warmth of the workshop, closing the door behind him. He slit the envelope with his thumb, a habit he had learned from his father, who had always said that a knife was for leather, not for paper, and drew out a single sheet, folded twice. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope, neat and deliberate, but the lines were not quite straight, as though the writer had been sitting at a table that was not level, or perhaps had been too tired to hold the paper steady. Dear Mr. Pendleton, I hope you will forgive the intrusion of a stranger. My name is Eleanor Hargreaves, and I am living temporarily at Cliff Cottage, on the Western Road, some 3 miles from the village. I have a pair of shoes, my husband's shoes, that I wish to have mended, but I am unable to bring them to you myself, as I am confined to the house by my health. I would be most grateful if you could call at your earliest convenience, bringing your tools and whatever materials you might need. I understand that this is an unusual request, and I am prepared to pay whatever you deem fair for the trouble. Yours sincerely, Eleanor Hargreaves. Arthur read the letter twice, then a third time. The words were simple, but there was something in the tone, a quietness, a carefulness, that reminded him of something he could not quite name. He looked at the clock on the mantel, 20 minutes past 7. The rain was still falling, and the night was dark, and the road to Cliff Cottage was a winding lane with no lamps, a lane he had not walked in years, not since the summer before his wife died, when they had gone to the cliffs to watch the sunset, and she had picked a handful of wild thyme and tucked it into his coat pocket. He folded the letter, placed it in his pocket, and turned to his workbench. He picked up the half-finished boot, considered it for a moment, and then set it aside. He would finish it tomorrow. Tonight, he would go. He reached for his leather satchel, the one he had carried since he was an apprentice, worn soft and dark from years of use, and began to pack his tools, the hammer, the awl, the curved needles, the waxed thread, the small pot of glue, the strips of leather in various thicknesses, the tin of polish. He paused, then added the brass lamp, though he had a small lantern he could light on the road, and the lamp was heavy and would take up room. But the lamp was the one he had used in the workshop for 30 years, and its light was steady, and he trusted it. He pulled on his coat, a heavy wool coat, dark gray, with a collar that turned up against the wind, and took his hat from the peg by the door. He blew out the lamp on the workbench, and the room went dark, and he stood for a moment in the darkness, listening to the rain, feeling the weight of the letter in his pocket, and the weight of something else, something older, something he had not allowed himself to look at for a long time. Then he opened the door, stepped out into the night, and closed it behind him. The rain had not stopped, but it had softened, becoming a fine, misty drizzle that hung in the air like a veil, and the gas lamps on Marlingate Lane cast their light in blurred halos, each one a small, golden island in the dark. Arthur walked slowly, his satchel slung across his shoulder, his boots, his own work, of course, a pair of stout black leather boots with thick soles and strong stitching, making a steady, measured sound on the wet cobbles. He knew every stone of this lane, every crack and every hollow, and he knew the sounds of the houses as he passed them, the creak of a shutter at number 3, where old Mrs. Prothero lived, the low murmur of a voice from number 5, where the vicar was reading aloud to his wife, the faint, sweet smell of wood smoke from number 9, where the chimney always drew just a little too slowly. He had lived on Marlingate Lane for 32 years. He had come here as a young man, newly married, with a small inheritance from his father, and a lease on the workshop that he had paid for with the first year's savings from his apprenticeship. He had built the business slowly, carefully, one pair of boots at a time, and the people of St. Mary's Bay had come to trust him, to know that a shoe mended by Arthur Pendleton would last another 10 years, that a boot he had made would fit like a second skin, that he would never rush, never cut a corner, never charge a penny more than the work was worth. His wife Clara had been the one who kept the books, who answered the door, who brought him cups of tea and sandwiches at midday, who sat in the back room in the evenings, and read aloud to him while he worked, novels mostly, but also poetry, and once, a book about the stars, which she had borrowed from the lending library in Rye, and which had made her laugh because she could not pronounce the Latin names. She had been small, quick, with dark hair that she pinned up in the mornings, and that always came loose by evening. And she had had a laugh that was like a bell, bright and clear and unexpected. She had died 3 years ago, in the winter of 1908, of a fever that had come on suddenly and taken her in 4 days. The doctor had said there was nothing to be done, that it was a particularly virulent strain of influenza, that she was not the only one, and Arthur had sat by her bed and held her hand and watched her breathe, and then stop breathing, and then he had gone downstairs and made a pot of tea, because that was what you did. That was what you did when there was nothing else to do. He had not slept through the night since, not once. It was not that he could not fall asleep. He could, often, especially after a long day's work, when his body was tired and his eyes were heavy. He would lie down in the bed that still smelled faintly of her lavender soap, and he would close his eyes, and sleep would come, soft and dark, and he would sink into it gratefully. But then, at 3 in the morning, without fail, he would wake, not with a start, not with a gasp, but simply open his eyes, as though the hour had called his name, and he would lie there in the darkness, perfectly still, and listen to the silence, and think of her. He had tried everything. He had tried drinking warm milk before bed, and then a glass of sherry, and then a small dose of laudanum, which the doctor had given him with a warning. He had tried walking late into the night until his legs ached and his feet were sore, and then falling into bed exhausted. He had tried changing the room, moving the bed to the other wall, hanging heavier curtains, but nothing worked. 3 o'clock came, and he was awake, and the world was quiet, and he was alone, and the grief was there, not sharp, not painful, but present, like a room he had to walk through every night, a room with no door. He had learned to fill the hour. He would get up, light the lamp, and go down to the workshop. He would pick up a piece of leather or a half-finished shoe, and he would work by the light of the brass lamp, the same lamp he carried now, the same lamp that had been his father's before him, and he would let the work take him, the rhythm of the needle, the pull of the thread, the small, precise movements of his hands. He would work until the hour passed, until the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the window, and then he would go back to bed and sleep for another hour or two, and get up and begin again. The neighbors had noticed, of course. Mrs. Bellamy had mentioned it, gently, over a cup of tea. "You look tired, Mr. Pendleton. You should rest more." And he had nodded, and said he would, and then he had gone back to his bench, because there was nothing else to do. He reached the end of Marlingate Lane, where the cobbles gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to the road that led out of the village. The road was wide here, lined with trees, the branches bare and dripping, and the mist hung low over the fields, hiding the shape of the land. He could hear the sea, faint and distant, a low, continuous murmur, like the sound of a shell held to the ear, and he could smell the salt and the damp earth and the faint, sweet scent of rotting leaves. He stopped for a moment, adjusting the strap of his satchel, and looked back at the village. The lights of the houses were small and warm, each one a promise of comfort, of safety, of the ordinary life that went on without him. He had been part of that life once, with Clara, and he had thought that he would be part of it forever, that the rhythm of the days and the seasons would carry him through to the end, and that he would grow old in the workshop, and that Clara would be there, in the back room, reading aloud, and that the world would be small and safe and good. But the world was not small, and it was not safe, and it was not good in the way he had thought. It was just the world, and it went on, and he went on, and the grief went on, like the tide, rising and falling, but never quite going away. he turned away from the village and began to walk. Arthur Pendleton had been a cobbler for 43 years, and in that time he had come to understand that the craft of making and mending shoes was not, as some believed, a simple matter of cutting leather and hammering nails. It was a discipline of patience, of observation, of knowing the shape of a foot as intimately as one knew the shape of one's own hand. It was a conversation between the hand and the material, a dialogue that took place in the small, steady movements of the awl and the needle, in the careful alignment of the sole, in the way the leather softened and yielded under the pressure of the last. He had learned the trade from Mr. Treadwell, a man of few words and great precision, who had taught him that the first thing to look at was not the shoe, but the person who would wear it. A shoe, Mr. Treadwell had said, on Arthur's first day as an apprentice, is a map of the wearer's life. The calluses, the wear patterns, the way the leather creases at the ball of the foot, all of it tells a story. Your job is to read that story, and then to make the shoe that fits it. It was a lesson that had stayed with Arthur, and over the years he had become adept at reading the stories that walked into his workshop. The farmer with the broad, flat feet and the heavy stride, whose boots wore down at the heel and the outer edge, and who needed a thick sole and a wide toe. The clerk, who walked to the station every morning, whose shoes showed a thin, even wear, and who needed a light, flexible sole that would not tire his feet. The widow who had inherited her husband's shoes and wanted them altered to fit her own narrow feet, and who had sat in the chair by the window and wept silently, while Arthur measured the length and the width and the arch, and he had pretended not to notice, and he had done the work for half the price he would have charged anyone else. The tools of his trade were simple, and they were old. The hammer he used was the one Mr. Treadwell had given him when he finished his apprenticeship, its head worn smooth, and its handle darkened with years of sweat and grip. The awl was a slender, curved blade, sharp enough to pierce the toughest leather, and he sharpened it himself, on a stone that had been in the family for 3 generations. The needles were fine, curved, and he threaded them with waxed linen thread, pulling it through the wax 3 times, so that it would not fray, so that it would hold, so that the stitch would last as long as the shoe. The leather he used came from a tannery in Lewes, a place he had visited once, many years ago, and whose smell he still remembered, the sharp, earthy tang of the bark, the rich, wet smell of the hides, the salt and the smoke, and the slow, patient work of turning raw skin into something that could be shaped and worn and loved. He ordered his leather by the side, and he kept it in the back room, stacked on shelves, wrapped in cloth, and he knew each piece by its texture, its weight, its grain. The calfskin was soft and supple, good for dress shoes and boots that needed to bend. The cowhide was thicker, tougher, for work boots and soles. The waxed leather was for the fishermen, who needed boots that would shed water and salt, and the deerskin was for the old men who had arthritis in their feet and could not bear the stiffness of a heavy sole. He had made shoes for the vicar, for the doctor, for the postman, for the widow who lived at the top of the hill and had not left her house in 7 years. He had made boots for the children who grew out of them too fast, and he had made slippers for the old women who sat by the fire and whose feet had swollen with age, and he had made a pair of shoes for a young man who was going to America, and who had stood in the workshop and talked about the future with such excitement that Arthur had felt, for a moment, the same thrill, the same sense of possibility, as though the world were opening up, as though anything were possible. And then the young man had gone, and Arthur had returned to his bench, and the world had closed again, and he had taken up his needle and his thread, and he had continued. The mending of a shoe was a different kind of work than the making of one. It was a negotiation with the past, a way of honoring what had been worn and used and loved, and of giving it a little more time. When a customer brought in a pair of shoes that had been walked to pieces, Arthur would hold them in his hands and he would feel the weight of the miles they had traveled, the days they had seen, the steps they had taken. He would see the way the sole had worn thin at the ball of the foot, the way the heel had tilted, the way the leather had cracked at the crease, and he would understand, in a way that was almost intimate, the life of the person who had worn them. He would cut a new sole from a piece of cowhide, and he would shape it to fit the old one, and he would hammer it into place with small, careful nails, and then he would stitch it, 100 stitches, 100 pulls of the thread, each one the same as the last, each one holding the shoe together, each one a small act of repair, of restoration, of hope. He was thinking of this as he walked along the road to Cliff Cottage, the rain misting his face, his satchel heavy on his shoulder. He was thinking of the shoes he would mend for Mrs. Hargreaves, and of the letter she had written, and of the way her handwriting had sloped, just a little, as though she had been tired, or sad, or perhaps both. He did not know what he would find at Cliff Cottage, but he knew that he would bring his tools, and his lamp, and his patience, and that he would do the work as carefully as he had done for 43 years, and that perhaps that would be enough. The road from the village to the cliffs was a winding lane, barely wide enough for a cart, that rose and fell with the contours of the land, passing through fields of stubble and pasture, past copses of ash and hazel, and over a small stone bridge that crossed a stream where the water ran clear and swift, even in the driest of summers. Arthur had walked this road many times, but never at night, never in the rain, and the familiarity of the landmarks, the old oak tree that leaned at an angle, the gate to Farmer Hodge's field, the bend where the road turned west and the sea came into view, was altered by the darkness, made strange and distant, as though he were seeing them for the first time. He carried his satchel slung across his body, the strap cutting into his shoulder, and in his left hand he held the brass lamp, which he had lit before leaving the village, its flame shielded by a small glass chimney. The light was warm and steady, casting a pool of gold on the ground before him, and it illuminated the wet gravel, the puddles, the leaves that had fallen and were beginning to rot. The rain hissed softly as it struck the glass, and the wind, which had been light in the village, was stronger here, carrying the salt of the sea and the smell of wet earth, and it tugged at his coat, his hat, the hem of his trousers. He had not walked this road since the summer before Clara died, when they had taken a picnic to the cliffs, and she had sat on a blanket and watched the gulls and eaten a hard-boiled egg and a slice of bread and butter, and he had lain on his back and looked at the clouds, and she had said, "Arthur, do you think we will ever leave this place?" And he had said, "No, I don't think so," and she had laughed and said, "Good, I don't want to." He had not thought of that day in a long time, but now it came back to him, the exact shade of the sky, the way the light had fallen on her face, the sound of her voice, and he felt a sharp, sudden ache in his chest, a pain that was not physical, but that was real, and that had been there, waiting, for 3 years, hidden beneath the routine of his days, the rhythm of his work, the steady, repetitive motion of his hands, the rhythm of his work, the steady, repetitive motion of his hands. He walked faster, as though he could outrun the memory, but the road was long, and the memory was patient, and it stayed with him, a shadow at his side. After a mile, the road passed through a small hamlet, just a few cottages, a blacksmith's forge, and a pub called the Ship and Anchor, its windows lit and warm, the sound of voices and laughter drifting out into the night. Arthur paused for a moment, considering whether to stop, to rest, to have a drink and warm himself by the fire. But the letter in his pocket was a weight, and he had promised to come, and so he walked on. The road beyond the hamlet was steeper, and the trees grew thicker, their branches meeting overhead to form a tunnel of darkness, and the rain fell more heavily here, drumming on the leaves, dripping from the branches, and the light of the lamp seemed smaller, more fragile, as though it could be extinguished at any moment by the damp and the cold. Arthur pulled his coat tighter, and he hunched his shoulders, and he kept walking, one foot after the other, his boots making a steady, squelching sound on the wet ground. He thought about the shoes he was going to mend. He wondered who the husband was, and why his shoes had been left behind, and why Mrs. Hargreaves wanted them mended now, after they had been worn and set aside. He thought about the way the leather would feel, the way the soles would be worn, the way the stitches would have loosened, and he began, almost unconsciously, to plan the work, to imagine the sequence of steps, the tools he would need, the time it would take. It was a habit, a way of calming his mind, of focusing on something that he could control, something that made sense. The world was full of things that did not make sense. The death of a wife, the loneliness of a house, the long, sleepless hours of the night. But a shoe was a shoe, and a stitch was a stitch, and if he did his work patiently, carefully, the shoe would be mended, and the world, for that moment, would be a little more whole. The road crested a hill, and the sea opened before him, a vast, dark expanse, the horizon invisible, the water black and silver under the clouds, the waves breaking against the cliffs with a low, rhythmic crash. He could smell the salt more strongly now, and the iodine of the seaweed, and the cold, clean air filled his lungs, and he felt, for a moment, a strange and unexpected calm, as though the sea had been waiting for him, as though it had known he would come. He walked along the cliff top, the road narrowing to a track, and in the distance he saw a light, a single, steady light, glowing from a window, and he knew that it was Cliff Cottage, and that he had arrived. The track that led to Cliff Cottage ran along the edge of the cliff, separated from the drop by nothing more than a low stone wall, its stones grown over with moss and lichen, and in the darkness the wall seemed to waver, to disappear, to become part of the sky and the sea. Arthur walked carefully, his lamp held high, his eyes fixed on the ground, watching for loose stones, for roots, for the places where the path had crumbled and the edge was closer than it should be. The wind was stronger here, a steady, insistent force that pressed against his side and carried the sound of the waves, a sound that was not loud but constant, like the breathing of a great animal, and his coat flapped, and his hat threatened to lift from his head, and he had to hold it with his free hand, his fingers pressed against the brim. The light from the cottage grew brighter as he approached, and he could see that it was a small, square building, built of gray stone, with a slate roof that glistened in the rain, and a chimney from which a thin plume of smoke rose, visible only for a moment before it was torn away by the wind. There was a garden in front of the cottage, enclosed by a low hedge, and in the garden there were flowers, late roses perhaps, or chrysanthemums, their petals dark and heavy with rain, and the smell of the wet earth and the damp leaves was sweet and rich, and it mixed with the salt of the sea in a way that was strange and beautiful. He reached the gate, a small wooden gate, painted white, its hinges rusty, and he pushed it open, and it creaked, a long, low sound that seemed to hang in the air, and he stepped into the garden. The path to the door was made of flat stones, set into the earth, and they were slick with rain, and he walked carefully, the lamp casting his shadow before him, long and thin, bending and stretching as he moved. He stood at the door, a heavy wooden door, painted dark green, with a brass knocker in the shape of a lion's head, and he lifted the knocker and let it fall, and the sound echoed, sharp and clear, and he waited. He heard footsteps inside, slow and deliberate, and then the sound of a bolt being drawn, and the door opened, and a woman stood before him, a woman of perhaps 60, with gray hair pulled back from her face, and dark eyes, and a face that was lined with age, and with something else, something that Arthur recognized, because he had seen it in the mirror every morning for 3 years. The face of someone who had lost a person they loved, and who had not yet learned to live without them. "Mr. Pendleton," she said, and her voice was low, and it shook a little, but it was not an unsteady voice, not a weak one. "Thank you for coming. I know it is a terrible night to be out." "It is not so terrible," Arthur said, and he was surprised to hear himself say it, because it was terrible, the rain and the wind and the dark. But now that he was here, standing in the doorway of this small, warm cottage, it seemed that the journey had been worth it, that the rain and the wind and the dark had been necessary, that they had brought him to this moment, and that this moment was exactly where he was meant to be. "Please, come in," she said, and she stepped aside, and Arthur crossed the threshold, and the door closed behind him, and he was inside. The cottage was small, but it was warm. The fire was burning in the grate, a coal fire, its flames shifting and settling, and the light from the oil lamps was soft and golden, and the air smelled of beeswax, and of wood smoke, and of something else, something floral and faint, like dried lavender. There was a table in the center of the room, covered with a cloth, and on the table there was a teapot, and 2 cups, and a plate of biscuits, and a small, unopened letter. Mrs. Hargreaves gestured to the chair by the fire. "Please sit down. You must be cold. I have tea ready, and I have a kettle on the hob if you prefer something stronger." Arthur set down his satchel and his lamp, and he took off his coat and his hat, and he hung them on a peg by the door, and he sat down in the chair, and the warmth of the fire seeped into his bones, and he felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease, the cold begin to leave his fingers, and he closed his eyes for a moment, just a moment, and he let the warmth take him. Mrs. Hargreaves poured tea, and she handed him the cup, and he wrapped his hands around it, feeling the heat through the porcelain, and he took a sip, and it was good, strong and sweet, with a hint of something, perhaps a slice of lemon, and he drank it slowly, and the silence between them was not awkward, but comfortable, the silence of 2 people who understood something about each other without having to say it. "The shoes," Mrs. Hargreaves said after a long moment, "are in the bedroom. I will bring them to you in a moment. But first, I wanted to thank you for coming. I know it is late, and the weather is—" She paused and smiled, a small, sad smile. "The weather is the weather. But I did not want to wait. I have been thinking about these shoes for a long time, and I decided, tonight, that it was time to have them mended." Arthur nodded. "I am glad to help," he said, and he meant it. Mrs. Hargreaves left the room, and Arthur sat alone by the fire, listening to the sounds of the cottage, the tick of a clock on the mantel, the hiss of the coal, the faint, distant murmur of the sea. He looked around the room, taking in the details, the bookshelves filled with volumes, their spines faded and worn, the small painting above the fireplace, a watercolor of the cliffs, done in soft blues and grays, the photograph on the sideboard, a man in a naval uniform, standing stiffly, his hand resting on the back of a chair, his face unsmiling. He looked at the photograph for a long moment, and he wondered if this was the husband, the man whose shoes he had come to mend, and he felt a sudden, unexpected tenderness for this stranger, for the man who had stood in that uniform, for the woman who had kept his photograph, for the shoes that had carried him through the last years of his life. He heard Mrs. Hargreaves returning, and he turned, and she was carrying a pair of shoes, a pair of men's shoes, black leather, plain and serviceable, the kind of shoes that a man might wear to work, or to church, or to walk along the cliffs on a Sunday afternoon. She set them on the table, and Arthur stood, and he walked over to look at them, and he picked them up, one in each hand, and he held them, and he felt the weight of them, the shape of them, the story of them. They were worn, but not badly worn. The soles were thin at the heels, and the leather was creased at the ball of the foot, and the stitching was loose in a few places, but the shoes were not beyond repair. They had been well cared for, polished regularly, stored with shoe trees, and Arthur saw that the maker's mark was stamped inside. A small, faded stamp, the name of a cobbler in Dover, a man he had never met but whose work he recognized. The careful, even stitching, the way the leather had been cut and shaped, the attention to detail. "These are good shoes," Arthur said, and he meant it. "They were made well. They have a lot of life left in them." Mrs. Hargreaves nodded, and she sat down in the chair across from him, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she looked at the shoes, and then she looked at Arthur, and her eyes were bright, but she did not cry. "They were my husband's shoes," she said. "He wore them for the last 10 years of his life. He was a fisherman, and then he was a coast guard, and then he was a retired man who walked the cliffs every morning, and he wore these shoes through all of it. I have kept them in his wardrobe since he died, and I have not been able to give them away, or throw them away, or even look at them, for a long time. But tonight, I thought it was time to have them mended. I thought I might wear them myself." She paused, and she looked at the shoes, and her hand went out, and she touched the toe of the right shoe, lightly, as though she were touching the hand of a sleeping child. "I know it is strange," she said, "a woman wearing her husband's shoes, but I have always had large feet, and his feet were small, not much larger than mine, and when I tried them on, just now, in the bedroom, they fit, almost perfectly. A little tight across the instep, perhaps, but that can be stretched. And I thought, if I could wear his shoes, if I could walk in them, then I would be walking a little of the way he walked, and I would be carrying him with me, and I would not be so alone." Arthur listened, and he did not say anything, because he understood. He understood the need to keep something, to hold on to something, to wear something that had been worn by the person you loved, because it was a way of keeping them close, of keeping them alive, of keeping them with you, even when they were gone. He had kept Clara's apron, the one she had worn in the kitchen, and he had kept her hairbrush, and he had kept the book of poetry she had been reading when she fell ill, and he had not been able to touch any of them, not for a long time, because they were too full of her, because they were too painful, because they were too real. But he had kept them. He had not thrown them away. He had not let them go. He looked at the shoes, and he saw the work that needed to be done. He would replace the soles, and he would restitch the seams, and he would stretch the leather across the instep, and he would polish them, and he would make them supple and strong, and they would be ready for Mrs. Hargreaves to wear, to walk in, to carry her husband with her, step by step, along the cliffs and into the future. He reached for his satchel, and he opened it, and he took out his tools, and he laid them on the table, one by one, the hammer, the awl, the needles, the thread, the wax, the strips of leather. He took out the brass lamp, and he lit it, and he set it on the table, and the light fell across the shoes, and across his hands, and he began to work. He worked for nearly an hour, the fire crackling at his side, the lamp casting a steady light, his hands moving with the slow, careful rhythm that he had learned so many years ago, and the shoes began to change, to take shape again, to become something that could be worn, that could be used, that could carry a woman along the cliffs on a morning walk. He removed the old soles, scraping away the worn leather, revealing the clean, smooth surface beneath. He cut new soles from the cowhide in his satchel, shaping them with his knife, fitting them to the curve of the shoe, and he hammered them into place, the nails small and even, each one driven with the same pressure, the same care. He threaded his needle, and he began to stitch, the thread pulling through the leather with a soft, rhythmic sound, a sound that was almost musical, a sound that he had been making for 43 years, and that he would make for as long as he could hold a needle. Mrs. Hargreaves sat in the chair by the fire, watching him, and she did not speak, but she did not need to. The silence between them was full, and it was comfortable, and it was the silence of two people who were doing something together, even if they were not speaking, even if they were not touching, even if they were only sharing a room, a fire, a pair of shoes. Arthur finished the first shoe, and he set it down, and he picked up the second, and he was about to begin the same work again, when he heard a sound from outside, a sound that was not the wind and not the sea, but a footstep, and then another, and then a knock on the door, a brisk, firm knock, 3 times, the same knock that he had heard from the boy on Marlingate Lane, but this time it was a man's hand, strong and sure. Mrs. Hargreaves stood, and she crossed to the door, and she opened it, and the wind rushed in, carrying the smell of the sea and the rain, and there, standing on the step, was a man, an old man, tall and thin, with a white beard and a face that was weathered and lined, like the face of a man who had spent his life outdoors, or who had spent his life looking at the sea. He was wearing a long coat, and he was carrying a lantern, and the light of the lantern cast his shadow on the wall behind him, and he looked at Mrs. Hargreaves, and then he looked past her, into the room, and he saw Arthur, and he nodded, and he smiled, a small, quiet smile, and he said, "I saw the light. I thought you might have company." Mrs. Hargreaves stepped aside, and the old man came in, and he took off his coat and his hat, and he hung them on the peg beside Arthur's, and he walked to the fire, and he held his hands out to the warmth, and he turned, and he looked at the shoes on the table, and at the tools, and at Arthur, and he said, "You are Mr. Pendleton, the cobbler. I have heard of you. I am Alistair Finch. I live in the cottage next door, the one behind the trees. I am a clockmaker, or I was, before I retired, and I saw the light." Arthur nodded, and he introduced himself, and he shook the old man's hand, and the hand was dry and warm, and the grip was firm, and the old man's eyes were clear and bright, and he looked at Arthur with a look that was not curiosity, but something else, something like recognition, as though he had seen Arthur before, or as though he had known that Arthur would come. "I hope I am not interrupting," Mr. Finch said, and he looked at Mrs. Hargreaves, and she shook her head, and she smiled, and she said, "No, you are not interrupting. Please, sit down. I will make another cup of tea." Mr. Finch sat down in the chair on the other side of the fire, and he looked at the shoes, and he looked at Arthur's hands, and he said, "You are doing good work. I can see it in the stitches. They are even, and they are tight, and they will hold. That is the most important thing in any craft, is that the work will hold." Arthur felt a small, quiet warmth at the compliment, and he said, "Thank you. I have been doing this for a long time." "And I have been doing my work for a long time," Mr. Finch said, and he reached into his pocket, and he took out a small brass object, a pocket watch, and he held it up, and the light from the fire caught the gold of the hands, and the glass of the face, and the delicate, intricate workings that were visible through the back. "I have been mending clocks for 50 years, and I have learned that time is a strange thing. It is not the same for everyone. It moves differently, depending on where you are, and what you are doing, and who you are with." He looked at Arthur, and his eyes were kind, and he said, "I think you know what I mean." Arthur looked at the clock on the mantel, and he saw that it was 10:15, and he felt a sudden, strange sense of dislocation, as though he had been in this room for hours, and as though he had been in this room for only a moment, and he said, "Yes, I think I do." Mr. Finch settled deeper into his chair, the firelight playing across the creases of his face, and he held the pocket watch up so that Arthur could see the delicate balance wheel, moving back and forth, with a rhythm that was almost too slow to notice, yet steady, unceasing, like the pulse of a sleeping man. "This watch belonged to my father," he said, his voice low and unhurried, "and Thew, his father, before him. It has been mended a dozen times, in a dozen different ways, and it still keeps time. Not perfectly, of course. It loses about 3 minutes a day, and it gains another 2 when the weather is damp, but it is reliable enough. It is the kind of watch that you can trust to carry you through the day, even if it does not carry you through the hour with precision. Arthur paused in his stitching, the needle held between his thumb and forefinger, and he looked at the watch and at the old man's hands, which were steady, the fingers long and thin, the nails clean and trimmed, the kind of hands that had spent a lifetime holding tiny screws and springs and wheels. 3 minutes a day, Arthur said. That is a curious thing. I have always thought that time was fixed, that there was no room for variation. Mr. Finch smiled, a slow, patient smile, and he put the watch back in his pocket, and he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Time is fixed in theory, he said, but in practice, it shifts. It is like the leather you work with, Mr. Pendleton. It has grain and memory. It stretches and shrinks. It behaves differently in rain and in sun, and so does time. The same hour can feel like a minute or like a day, depending on what you are doing and on what you are feeling. Mrs. Hargreaves returned from the kitchen, carrying a tray with 3 cups of tea, the steam rising in thin spirals, and she set the tray on the small table beside the fire, and she handed a cup to Mr. Finch, and then to Arthur, and then she sat down with her own, and she wrapped her hands around the warm porcelain, and she listened. Arthur took a sip of the tea, and it was strong and slightly bitter with a hint of honey, and it was hot enough to warm him from the inside, and he felt a loosening in his shoulders, a softening that he had not felt in a long time. He looked at the shoes on the table, the first one finished, the second one waiting, and he said, I have been working with leather for 43 years, and I have never thought of it as having memory. I have thought of it as having texture and thickness and strength, but memory, that is an interesting way to see it. It does have memory, Mr. Finch said. You can see it in the creases, in the way the leather has folded around a foot, in the way it has absorbed the shape of a person's movement. A well-worn shoe is like a clock that has been wound 1,000 times. It carries the imprint of the person who wore it, and when you mend it, you are not just repairing a piece of leather, you are honoring that imprint. You are allowing it to continue. Arthur looked down at the shoes again, and he saw them differently now. He saw the slight depression where the ball of the foot had pressed, the curve where the arch had been, the faint discoloration where the leather had been touched by salt and rain, and the sweat of a man who had walked the cliffs every morning. He understood then that he was not simply replacing soles, he was preserving a shape, a history, a life. Mrs. Hargreaves spoke, her voice soft, almost a whisper. I have not worn his shoes yet, she said. I only tried them on, but I could feel him in them. The way the leather had given way, the way the heel had worn down on the outside, because he walked with a slight limp from an old injury. I could feel the shape of his foot, and I thought, if I wear them, I will be walking where he walked, and I will be standing where he stood, and I will be continuing something. Arthur nodded, and he set down his tea, and he picked up the second shoe, and he took the old sole off, carefully, because he did not want to damage the upper, and he began to shape the new sole, his knife moving through the cowhide with a clean, smooth motion, and he said, I understand that. I have kept my wife's apron, and her hairbrush, and her book of poetry. I have kept them in a drawer, and I have not touched them, because I was afraid that if I touched them, they would lose her. But perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps touching them would keep her with me in a different way. Mr. Finch nodded, and he took a slow sip of his tea, and he said, Yes, that is the thing about objects. They are not alive, but they hold life. They are vessels, and we are allowed to use them, to handle them, to let them carry us back to the people we have lost, even if only for a moment. The fire crackled, and the rain continued to fall, soft and steady, and the room was filled with the sound of the clock on the mantel, ticking, 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 marking the seconds that were, in that moment, neither too fast nor too slow. but simply passing, as the world outside the cottage continued its long, slow turning. Arthur finished the second shoe just as the clock on the mantel struck 11, the chimes clear and thin, like the sound of a spoon tapping against crystal. He set the shoe beside its mate, and he sat back in his chair, and he looked at them, and they were whole again, the leather supple and polished, the soles firm and even, the stitches tight and straight. He ran his fingers along the seam, feeling the slight raised ridge of the thread, and he was satisfied. The shoes were ready. Mrs. Hargreaves had fallen asleep in her chair, her head tilted to one side, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing slow and regular. Mr. Finch was still awake, but his eyes were half closed, and he was looking into the fire, his lips moving slightly, as though he were murmuring to himself. The room was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock and the occasional hiss of a raindrop falling into the flames. Arthur stood, and he walked to the window, and he parted the curtain, and he looked out at the night. The rain had softened to a fine mist, and the moon was visible through a thin break in the clouds, a pale, watery crescent that cast a silver light across the sea. The water was dark and calm, and it moved in long, slow swells, rising and falling, like the chest of a sleeper. He could see the lights of a ship far out, a tiny point of yellow against the black, and he could hear the sound of the waves breaking on the shingle below the cliff, a sound that was like a whispered word, repeated again and again, never quite distinct, never quite silent. He thought of Clara, of the way she had loved the sea. She had grown up in a fishing village, and she had always said that the sea was a living thing, that it had moods and voices, that it could be kind and cruel and indifferent by turns. She had taught him to listen to it, to hear the difference between the sound of a storm rising and the sound of a calm night. She had stood beside him on the pier, her hand in his, and she had pointed out the seals basking on the rocks, and the gulls wheeling above the cliffs, and the way the light moved across the water in the evening, like molten silver. He had not been to the sea since she died. He had avoided it, because the sea was full of her, and he had not been able to bear the weight of that. But now, standing at Mrs. Hargreaves's window, looking out at the same sea that Clara had loved, he felt something shift inside him, a small, quiet movement, like a door opening a crack. The mist seemed to thicken, and the moon dimmed, and the lights of the ship disappeared behind a veil of cloud, and the world was reduced to the window, the glass, the darkness, and the sound of the water. Arthur pressed his forehead against the cold pane, and he closed his eyes, and he listened. He heard the waves, the soft, rhythmic pulse of them, and he heard the wind moving through the trees outside, a low, hollow sound, like a breath drawn from a great distance. He heard the ticking of the clock behind him, and the crackle of the fire, and the breathing of the two people in the room, one asleep, one half awake. And he heard, or thought he heard, something else, a voice, not spoken, but felt, like a memory rising to the surface of his mind. "It is all right," the voice said. "You can let go." He opened his eyes, and the window was fogged with his breath, and he reached up and wiped a circle in the condensation, and he saw the sea again, and it looked different, less heavy, less daunting. It looked like water and sky and the endless turning of the earth, and it was beautiful, in its own quiet, distant way. He turned away from the window, and he walked back to the table, and he looked at the shoes, and he thought of Mrs. Hargreaves, and of her husband, and of the walk she would take in the morning, along the cliffs, carrying him with her, step by step. And he thought of his own walk, back to Marlingate Lane, and to his shop, and to the empty rooms above it, and he wondered if he could carry Clara with him too, in a different way, not in the clothes she had worn, but in the memory of her voice, and her hand, and her love of the sea. Mr. Finch stirred in his chair, and he opened his eyes, and he looked at Arthur, and he said, "You are thinking." Arthur nodded. "Yes, I am thinking about the sea, and about my wife." Mr. Finch's expression softened, and he said, "That is a good thing. The sea is a place to think." Mr. Finch sat up, and he reached for the kettle that was warming on the hearth, and he refilled his cup with hot water, and he added a pinch of tea from the caddy, and he stirred it slowly, watching the leaves spiral and settle. Then he settled back in his chair, and he looked at the fire, and he began to speak, his voice low and unhurried, as though he were sharing something he had not told anyone in a long time. "I was not always a clockmaker in a cottage by the sea," he said. "I was a clockmaker in London, in a small shop off Fleet Street, and I had a wife and a daughter and a life that was filled with the noise of the city and the smell of coal and horse dung and the constant, hurried tick of 1,000 clocks. I made a good living, and I was content, or I thought I was. But then my daughter fell ill when she was 12 years old, and she died, and my wife never recovered from it. She died a year later, of a broken heart, or so the doctor said, and I was left with the shop, and the clocks, and the silence of an empty house." Arthur listened, and he felt a tightness in his chest, because he knew that kind of silence, the silence that followed loss, the silence that filled a room with the absence of a loved one. "I stayed in London for another year," Mr. Finch continued, "but the city became unbearable. Every clock I repaired seemed to tick too loudly, to mock me with the passing of time that I could not have back. I sold the shop, and I moved here, to this cottage, because it was far from the city, and because I could hear the sea, and the sea, I thought, would be easier to bear than the ticking of clocks." He paused, and he took a sip of his tea, and the steam rose around his face, and his eyes were distant, lost in the memory. "For the first few years, I did nothing but walk along the cliffs, and watch the waves, and listen to the wind. I did not touch a single clock, not even my father's pocket watch. I put it in a drawer, and I left it there, because I did not want to be reminded of time. But time did not stop, of course. It kept going, whether I acknowledged it or not. And one day, I took the watch out, and I wound it, and I set it, and I listened to it tick, and it was not painful. It was comforting. It was like the sound of a heartbeat, steady and reliable, even when the heart that had once belonged to it was gone." Arthur thought about his own tools, his own workbench, the shoes he had mended over the years. He thought about the thousands of soles he had cut, the thousands of stitches he had sewn, the thousands of shoes he had handed back to their owners, and he realized that he had never thought of his work as a comfort. He had thought of it as a duty, a way to fill the hours, a way to earn a living. But it was more than that. It was a rhythm, a pattern, a way of moving through the world that did not depend on the presence or absence of any one person. "The sea helped," Mr. Finch said, "because the sea does not care about our grief. It does not change its tide because a man has lost his daughter. It does not soften its waves because a woman has lost her husband. It just keeps moving, and that indifference, that constancy, is a kind of mercy. It reminds us that we are small, and that our losses are small, and that the world will go on without us, and that, somehow, that is a relief." Arthur nodded slowly, and he looked at the shoes on the table, and he said, "And the clocks? Did you go back to them?" Mr. Finch smiled. "Yes, I started repairing them again, slowly, one at a time. First for myself, then for the people in the village. I found that I enjoyed the precision, the smallness of the work. I enjoyed the way a tiny screw could hold a mechanism together, the way a spring could store energy and release it over time. I enjoyed the fact that a clock, once repaired, would keep time, even if the time it kept was not the time I had lost." He brought his hand to his pocket, and he took out the pocket watch again. and he held it up, and the firelight caught the brass, and the glass, and the delicate hands that pointed to the hour and the minute. "This watch has been with me through all of it," he said. "It has lost 3 minutes a day, and gained 2, and it has never stopped. And I have come to think that is the point. Not that time is perfect, but that it keeps moving, no matter what." Arthur looked at the watch, and he thought of the shoes he had just mended, and he thought of the man who had worn them, and the woman who would wear them next, and he felt a quiet sense of acceptance, a letting go of something he had been holding on to, tightly, for too long. The fire had burned down to a bed of embers, glowing a deep orange red, and the room was dimmer, softer, the shadows long and still. Mrs. Hargreaves stirred in her chair, but did not wake, and Mr. Finch had fallen silent, his head bowed, the pocket watch still in his hand, his breathing slow and steady. Arthur sat at the table, the shoes in front of him, and he felt a strange heaviness in his limbs, a tiredness that was not just physical, but something deeper, something that had been pressing upon him for years, and that he had refused to acknowledge. He had been holding himself together, he realized, like a clock that had been wound too tightly, the spring under constant tension, the gears grinding against each other, the whole mechanism straining against the force of its own winding. He had been afraid to stop, afraid that if he let himself rest, the grief would catch up with him, that it would overwhelm him, that he would be swallowed by it. But here, in this cottage, by the fire, with the sound of the sea in his ears, and the smell of tea and leather and wood smoke in his nose, he felt a loosening, a softening, a release. He reached into his own pocket, and he took out the stub of a pencil and a small notebook, the one he used for recording orders, and he opened it to a blank page, and he wrote, in his neat, careful hand, the name of his wife. Clara Pendleton. He wrote the date, 12 September 1908, and then he wrote, below it, a single word. Remembered. He closed the notebook, and he put it back in his pocket, and he felt lighter, as though he had set down a burden he had not known he was carrying. He looked at the shoes again, and he saw them not as objects to be repaired, but as vessels, as carriers of memory, as bridges between the living and the dead. And he understood that the work he did was not just about leather and thread and nails. It was about connection. It was about helping people move forward, one step at a time, even when the person they wanted to walk with was no longer there. The tiredness in his limbs grew heavier, and his eyelids drooped, and he felt a warmth spreading through his chest, a warmth that came not from the fire, but from something inside him, something that had been cold and still for a long time, and was now beginning to thaw. He leaned back in his chair, and he let his head rest against the wooden back, and he looked at the ceiling, at the shadows moving across the plaster, and he listened to the sound of the sea, and the breathing of the two people in the room, and the ticking of the clock on the mantel. The sounds seemed to merge, to blend into a single, steady rhythm, a rhythm that matched the rise and fall of his own breath, the beat of his own heart. He did not fight it. He did not argue with it. He simply allowed himself to be carried, to be held, to be taken by the gentle current of the night. Mr. Finch looked up, and he saw Arthur's eyes closing, and he smiled, a small, quiet smile, and he said, in a voice that was barely a whisper, "Good, rest now. There is nothing else to do tonight." And Arthur heard the words, or felt them, and he let go, fully and completely, and he felt himself falling, not into darkness, but into a soft, warm, endless space, where the sea and the fire and the ticking of the clock were all the same sound, and where Clara was waiting for him, not as a ghost, but as a memory, a thought, a hand reaching out to touch his cheek, just once, before he drifted away. Sleep came. It did not ask permission. It did not knock at the door or announce its arrival. It came like the tide, slowly at first, a creeping edge of darkness that advanced across the shore of his consciousness, then accelerated, filling the hollows and the crevices, rising up and over the rocks of his waking thoughts, until there was nothing left above the surface but a thin, shimmering film of awareness, and then that, too, was gone. Arthur's head lolled to the side, and his hands, which had been resting on the table, slid slowly apart, and his breathing deepened, slowed, became regular and full, the breath of a man who had finally surrendered to the weight of the day. The leather shoes lay on the table before him, silent and still, their work done, waiting only for the morning. Mrs. Hargreaves opened her eyes, and she saw Arthur asleep in his chair, and she saw Mr. Finch nodding over his pocket watch, and she smiled, a soft, tired smile, and she stood, careful not to disturb them, and she went to the kitchen, and she brought back a wool blanket, which she draped over Arthur's shoulders, tucking the corners gently around him, as though he were a child. Then she covered Mr. Finch with a shawl, and she sat down again, and she looked at the fire, and she felt a peace that she had not felt in many months, a peace that came from the simple presence of other people, from the shared quiet of a room, from the knowledge that the shoes would be ready in the morning. The fire crackled one last time, and a log shifted, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, and then the embers settled into a steady, low glow, casting a warm, ruddy light across the room. The clock on the mantel ticked on, counting the seconds, the minutes, the hours. But the time it counted did not seem to matter. What mattered was the stillness, the softness, the way the shadows lay, like gentle hands, over the sleeping faces of the people in the room. Arthur dreamed. He dreamed of Marlingate Lane, of his shop with its small window and its worn sign, of the rows of shoes on the shelves, and of Clara, sitting in the back room, reading her poetry book, her lips moving silently, her finger tracing the lines. She looked up at him, and she smiled, and she said, "You have done well, Arthur. You have done what you could. That is enough." He tried to speak, to tell her that he missed her, that he had kept her apron and her hairbrush and her book, that he had not known how to let her go, but the words would not come, and it did not matter, because she understood. She always understood. The dream shifted, and he was walking along a cliff path, the sea on one side, the fields on the other, and the sun was rising, a pale, golden light that spread across the water like honey. He was wearing a pair of shoes, not his own, but the shoes he had just mended, and they fit perfectly, and the leather was warm and supple, and they carried him forward, step by step, along the edge of the world. He walked, and the wind was gentle, and the gulls cried overhead, and the sea was a deep, calm blue, and he felt a peace that he had not felt in years, a peace that was not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of something else, something that held both the sorrow and the joy, and that made them bearable. He walked, and he did not look back. The night deepened around the cottage, and the rain stopped, and the mist cleared, and the moon, now high in the sky, cast a pale, silver light through the window, falling across the table, across the shoes, across the sleeping form of Arthur Pendleton, who was still, so still that the blanket over his shoulders barely rose and fell with his breath. The clock on the mantel struck 2 in the morning, and then 3, and then 4, and each chime was a small, clear note that hung in the air for a moment before fading into the silence. Mr. Finch had woken briefly at the stroke of 3, and he had gone to the kitchen to fetch a glass of water, and he had stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit sea, and then he had returned to his chair, and he had fallen asleep again, his head resting on his hand. Mrs. Hargreaves had not slept deeply, but she had drifted in and out, her dreams filled with images of her husband, of his hands, of his voice, of the way he had laughed at the kitchen table. She had woken once, and she had looked at the shoes, and she had touched them, lightly, and she had felt a warmth, as though the leather had held onto the heat of Arthur's hands, and she had smiled, and she had gone back to her half-sleep. The fire died down to a bed of ash, white and delicate, with a few small glowing embers at the bottom, like jewels buried in snow. The room grew cooler, but not cold, and the air was still and quiet, carrying the faint scent of the sea, of salt and wet stone, and the lingering trace of the tea, and the leather, and the brass of Mr. Finch's pocket watch. Arthur's dream had changed again. He was no longer walking along the cliff. He was in a garden, a small, walled garden, with roses climbing up the brick, and a stone bench, and a fountain that was dry. But the sound of water was in his ears, and he knew that the water was the sea, and that the garden was a place he had never been, but that it felt like home. Clara was there, sitting on the bench, her head bent over her book, and when she looked up, her face was younger, smoother, the face of the woman he had married, not the woman who had grown thin and pale in the last months of her illness. She smiled, and she gestured for him to sit beside her, and he did, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and she said, "It is a good place, isn't it?" He nodded, and he could not speak, because his throat was full, but he did not need to. "You have been working too hard," she said. "You have been holding on to too much, but it is all right. You can let go now. I am not going anywhere." And he believed her. He let his head rest against hers, and he closed his eyes, and he felt the warmth of her, the solidity of her, the reality of her, even though he knew, somewhere in the back of his mind, that this was a dream. But the dream was real enough, and the comfort was real, and that was what mattered. The chimes of the clock struck 5, and the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the curtains, a thin gray light that touched the edges of the room, the corners, the shadows, and slowly, gently, it began to push back the night. Arthur stirred, but did not wake. His hand moved, and it touched the shoe on the table, and his fingers rested there, on the smooth, polished leather, and he smiled, a small, unconscious smile, and he stayed still, in the borderland between sleep and waking, where the sea and the garden and Clara were all one, and where the world was safe and warm and full of peace. The light grew stronger, and the room became visible in all its quiet, ordinary detail. The worn armchairs, the patterned wallpaper, the brass clock on the mantel, the kettle on the hearth, the 2 shoes on the table, side by side, gleaming softly in the morning glow. The fire had gone out entirely, and the air was cool and fresh, carrying the smell of the sea and the damp earth, and the sound of the waves was clearer now, a steady, rhythmic pulse that seemed to quicken with the arrival of the day. Mrs. Hargreaves was the first to wake. She opened her eyes, and she saw the light, and she saw the shoes, and she saw Arthur, still asleep, the blanket around his shoulders, his hand resting on the shoe. She stood, slowly, her bones creaking, and she went to the window, and she drew back the curtain, and she looked out at the sea, which was gray and calm, the sky a pale, washed blue, the clouds thin and high. She turned, and she said, softly, "Mr. Pendleton." Arthur stirred, and he opened his eyes, and for a moment he did not know where he was, and then he saw the room, and the shoes, and Mrs. Hargreaves standing by the window, and he remembered. He sat up, and the blanket fell from his shoulders, and he rubbed his face with his hands, and he said, "What time is it?" "It is just past 6, she said. "The sun will be up soon. I think I will take my walk." Arthur looked at the shoes, and he picked up the right one, and he inspected it, running his thumb along the seam, and he found it good. He picked up the left, and it was the same. He set them down, and he said, "They are ready." Mrs. Hargreaves came to the table, and she picked up the shoes, and she held them in her hands, and she looked at them, and she looked at Arthur, and she said, "Thank you." He nodded. There was nothing else to say. Mr. Finch stirred in his chair, and he yawned, and he stretched, and he looked at the two of them, and he smiled. "A good night's work," he said. "A good night's sleep, too." Arthur stood, and he gathered his tools, and he put them back in his satchel, one by one, the hammer, the awl, the needles, the thread, the wax, the strips of leather. He folded the brass lamp and placed it beside them. He took his coat from the peg, and he put it on, and he tied his hat. Mrs. Hargreaves sat down on the chair by the fire, and she put on the shoes. They fit, a little snug across the instep, but the leather would give, and the soles were firm, and the heels were straight. She stood, and she took a step, and then another, and she walked to the door, and she looked back at Arthur, and she said, "I will think of you when I walk." Arthur smiled, a small, tired smile, and he said, "And I will think of you when I mend." He walked to the door, and he stepped out into the morning, and the air was cool and clean, and the sea was spread before him, gray and silver and endless, and the path along the cliff rose up to his left, and the village lay behind him, and he began to walk, not toward the sea, but back, toward Marlingate Lane, toward his shop, toward the life that was waiting for him. He walked, and the shoes he wore were his own, old and worn, but they would need mending soon, and he would do it, and the work would carry him through another day, and another night, and another year, and he would remember the sea, and the cottage, and the old clockmaker, and the woman who had worn her husband's shoes, and he would think of Clara, and the garden of his dream, and he would be content. The sun rose, and the light spread across the water, and the world began to stir, and Arthur Pendleton, the cobbler of Marlingate Lane, walked into the morning, his satchel over his shoulder, his hands in his pockets, and the sound of the sea fading behind him, until it was only a whisper, only a memory, only a gentle, distant song.